In September of 2022, Colin Koskinen and I made a trip from our home in Michigan to see Jim Ward's 137-acre Indiana whitetail property. We showed up to find Jim on his knees making a 3D terrain map to help us understand the property. To manage deer on your property, understanding terrain and the layout of features is the most important first step. Without it, you are like a blindfolded person trying to figure out how to hit a target. Jim Ward developed a deep understanding of the importance of terrain features as a Marine Lance Corporal serving in Okinawa, where he learned to create on-the-spot 3D terrain maps using sand and sticks because it was critically important to have a feel for the ground, and it was difficult to navigate in the dense forest using a compass. As team leader, Jim became proficient at building these terrain models on the ground in the field. Here's Jim Ward now to tell us about his ground.
Well, today we're here, Dr. Jim Brauker and myself, and what I have here is a 3D map of a 137-acre property in south central Indiana, and just kind of go over a little bit of how the property is laid out and talk about terrain features and even a little bit about how I do things. So our day today is we're going to run around here and come up with some video to start educating again. And
it's been a while.
Right? And one of the reasons it's been a while is because it's aggravating. But anyways, back to it's enjoyable at the same time. So, but yeah, it's what is it, guys? The 12th of September today?
Yes.
And most guys aren't on their property the 12th of September, walking the entire property because they're pretty shook up about season right around the corner, and the bucks have shed their velvet, or several of them have that I got on camera. And a lot of guys start talking about a change in their home range and that type of thing. I do deer habitat, a lot of guys know. The only time I've been able to work on this property for the last 4 years is September and October, and a little bit in January. And so I'm not a bit worried about walking through this property today. I have more security cover on this property than any property that you'll be on. And along with that security cover, I got access for the deer to move around fast if they need to or want to. And so these deer know my smell. They know the sound of my chainsaw, and I'm not a bit worried about this. So I want to go to talk about property layout, and this is the general, what I feel the general rubber stamp version that every property should try to focus on, or start with anyways. And what I do is a perimeter trail. I start thinking about access. How am I going to get in? So the first year I got this property, it had just been logged, and where we're standing at right now is right here. This was the only place I had to park to get off of the county road was right here, and this is a log landing. And what happened was we would pull in here, the property's wide open, and I got 5 little ridges that come out here and dead end right, pointed right to this here log landing. And so I knew immediately when I started hunting this and parking here that most of the deer on this property was going to know I was here. And that's exactly what's happened. And so 2 years ago, I found my best set of sheds ever on the property right here on the end of this point, which I can see from where I'm standing. And so anyways, this was naturally the worst place to park on the property. And it was the only place I had to get off the road. So now what I've done is I got a small dozer, and I've made a little parking spot here and a little parking spot on the property line down there. And so this arrow shows north, that indicates north. And so we have a dominant west wind. Hunting season, a lot of times it's a southwest wind, and so entering right on the north property line or right on the south property line, depending on wind direction, is very important, I feel. So access is critical, but how you walk in that access, I feel might be more important even. And what I'm saying is so many people do the Elmer Fudd, sneak along with their gun and show that body language that they're the predator, and I feel like that's a big no-no. A lot of people want to have the area that they're accessing through to be wide open so that the deer will not be there when they're accessing, and I don't really see that that's the answer. What I have all along my accesses is so this would be right off the property line. So I run a nylon hay baling twine down my line as a marker to begin with, so that the neighbors know, everybody knows, and then that's where I'm accessing. If I feel like that's a neighbor that's going to use my access line as a shooting lane, I'll move my access off of that line a little bit to where I have some brush there, to where it's not a situation that they can use my clean access for that. But you know, most neighbors are good, so we're just gonna stay on the line for the most part.
You know, the thing you're talking about deer seeing you sneaking along.
Yeah.
I have had a situation before where I'm at the edge of a field walking back to hunt, and I see a group of deer and they got their heads up looking at me, and I just turn like this and walk away, because I can't go through there anymore anyway. So I just turn and walk away, and I just turn from Hunter Jim into Farmer Jim,
Yeah.
and they just put their heads back down and start eating again.
No, 100%, right?
Yeah.
What I was saying, I get it thick, so I'll have a trail, and then I hinge cut on the inside of that trail, and then on the back side of that hinge cut wall, I'll have a deer access trail typically, right? And so I'm not wanting to walk on the deer trails if I can possibly help that, but then I go fanatic on my scent on my boots so that I don't have so much trouble with that also. But if I end up, like Dr. Brauker just mentioned, if I end up running into deer or realize deer are bedded in a situation, what I have seen most of the time, that different family groups, they want to be about 75 yards apart when they're bedding, and so I just mark that as a bedding area and go around it and give them their space, right? And so it's not that big a deal, I don't believe, and I can get away with so much more if I have it thick, and if they feel safe, they'll just lay down a lot of times and let you walk right by them and not bust off the property. And another thing, in the snow, I've realized many times, if I bust deer and they run off onto the neighbors, about 300 yards up here, what they're going to do is circle right back onto my property, because mine's the safe property. Security cover is by far the #1 thing to have wildlife on your property, period, on the age of the animal. When security cover can be food, it's a win-win. And that's what I have here. So everybody wants to lay their property out slightly different. What I want to have, I have low deer numbers in this area. I'm trying to grow deer numbers. I'm trying to grow timber, and at the same time improve my odds on hunting a mature buck, harvesting a mature buck.
Can you explain why it is that you want to have food in the bedding area? Because I've heard some people that have pretty good reputations in hunting say, you know, you don't want them to have food nearby because then they got to get up to go get the food. What are your thoughts on that?
That's what I thought too 15 years ago.
Yeah, me too.
Before I started actually realizing mature bucks, you know, during hunting season, typically they're not after food, they're after the girls. And so, and Dr. Deere explained that with the 4-stomach system that they have, they can fill that first stomach in 20 minutes. And I've never found one with an empty stomach when I've gutted them. And so, you know, I think food in the bedding area has increased the number of deer bedded in my bedding areas 3-fold. And then because it's thick with security cover, I get as close to that bedding as I can.
Yeah.
And you know,
I'm in a situation where I'm able to observe sometimes 2 or 3 doe families all day long.
Oh, for sure.
Way up on a ridge down into the creek bottom, and they're on their feet 2, 3, 4 times during the day, the whole family. One will get up and then the other gets up and they're browsing for a while and then they lay right back down and they haven't left that spot, and the guys on the neighboring property never saw them because they were in a safe zone.
Well, that's 100% exactly the way it happens. I know we've talked about the study I had done with cameras out in Nebraska, and the guy didn't want me to put the cameras on the deer beds during hunting season, so we done it in May, and that caused a couple other problems, but put them out May 5th, 24 cameras on 24 deer beds, and made them take a picture every 15 seconds. It was a Plot Watcher Pro, and so depending on the side of the hill that they was on, they would get between 1,650 and 1,800 photos a day per camera. In 6 weeks, I think that was somewhere around 3.1 million photos. And so what I had seen is exactly what you said. The average amount of time that a deer is in a bed is about 1 hour and 15 minutes during the day. And so they're wanting to get up and walk around and browse, and they'll spend about 50% of their time or more laying there chewing their cud, not sleeping. They're just nodding their head. But yeah, so
But they also don't necessarily lay back down in the same spot.
100%.
They're in a safe zone, and they might have 3 or 4 beds in there, and they're going to browse around for a while, then lay down in a little bit.
You nailed it
spot.
exactly. It's almost always 3 to 4 beds is what I've realized over the years, and it's usually in about a 10-yard circle for that individual deer or deer family, and the position of that bed is more critical than anything. And what I mean is well, we can get into that. That's a whole long video there. But so yes, let's just talk for a second about bedding, right? And so here's a bedding, what I would call a bedding ridge. And I want to show here, I put some little plastic trees in here, but the way I lay out a bedding area now is I am going to hinge cut in walls. And so I used to hinge cut in huts. And so I've changed that completely. And the reason I have is because you had to get back in there and be able to do maintenance. And one of the things that I had done wrong in the past on hinge cutting is going in and making too many huts. And I get a lot of sun in there to keep those hinge cuts alive, but it would get so thick because of the diverse vegetation coming in with the briars and everything that it was a lot of work to cut that back apart and get in there. And so now, doing walls of cover, what I do is I'll find a bigger tree and I'm wanting to parallel the direction of the ridge. And so what a buck wants to do is typically the safest area, just like when we was in the Marine Corps, we'd dig our fighting hose, was right out here on the end. This is the safest area naturally that he can be in, or any deer can be in. And so what you end up with is him wanting to lay on the last flat spot before it rose over the hill. And so if it's a bench or whatever, that works also. But he's going to lay there because of thermal effects. And so when we dig our fighting hose, it's the same exact deal. You don't want to be up on the very top because then you're silhouetted. You get right over that edge just a little bit and you're not military crest. And so when I hinge cut, I take a bigger tree and drop it parallel with where the ridge, how the ridge runs, and then I want to make sure that he has access to lay down out here on this outside edge. He wants to be able to see, and I'll let him, unless I need to access there, but then also to get more sun in here, I'll come out here and cut these trees, and typically on a hillside, they naturally just want to go down, and I'll allow that because one, it's easier and faster. But, so I hinge cut a wall, and then another important thing that I do is I'll hinge cut the big trees, and I do what I call follow up. You can call it whatever you want, but I go along and take my small trees and hinge cut them on top of my big wall, and what that makes is my little huts and keeps it organized. And I hinge cut my wall a little bit lower and make my small trees hinge cut them higher because now I can control them easier. And so it makes all my little huts down along there. So I have access down the middle, access down this outside edge, and here at the end what I'm going to have basically is 3 trails come together. And then when you come back in there, you can ride your 4-wheeler or whatever. That's what I want, is to be able to get down in here with all my equipment and work fast. The more work you get done on property, the more diverse cover you get down in front of their face, the more wildlife you're going to have. And then I break this up also. Naturally, the does want to bed up here by the open field. Naturally, the bucks want to bed in the safest spot. When I done that camera deal we was just talking about, we done all our bedding out here on benches and out here on the end of these points. 2 weeks in, we had our bucks using our bedding. 2 weeks in, the does come off of the food sources and used our buck bedding. And it ran all of our bucks out. And then we had fawns in those beds and does, and that lasted for about a 3-week period of time or so. And then the does were right back up on the food and the bucks were right back in the bedding. One other important thing, the reason I hunt closer to bedding than I ever had in the past, is that I never got a picture of a buck in a bed before 8:30 in the morning. And I'm saying thousands of photos of bucks in beds and never did before 8:30 in the morning. And so that's just critical information.
It really is. In the position I'm in on my 43 acres, where I'm way up on the ridge with my scent going 50 feet above the deer that are down, I've observed the same thing. The bucks come in around 8:30, 9:30 in the morning. They lay down for an hour, and then they're going to move, check out the doe spots, maybe lay down in a different spot.
And we're seeing that because of the locations that we're hunting, right? And so some hunters say, oh, I see them right at this time or that time. Well, it's where they're at in the process
all day long.
Yes,
Where are they at all day long? They're in a completely safe zone where they've never smelled a human all season long. They've been pushed onto this little 43 acres, for example, from all the surrounding properties. All the deer in the square mile are there, or most of them, during the daytime. And so you're seeing them in their natural. What do? When they feel safe, they lay down for an hour and then they get up. And they browse, or they go look for some does.
Right.
But I almost never see deer in there until 8:30 in the morning.
And if they have nothing to eat, two things that tells you in there, they're not going to stay in there all day long without having something in their stomach. And then there's no place to hide because the security cover is their food. That's what they eat.
Yes. Absolutely.
And so a guy says, I don't want any food in my bedding area. Well, you don't have any cover in your bedding area if you don't want any food. You know?
You're not going to get any doe families either, because those doe families, that mother doe has a hard time keeping her fawns under control. So, you know, the little buck fawn's going to get up and wander away. So she wants to be near a food source, because what gets him up is hunger and curiosity. So the closer he is to her, the easier she'll be able to track him down when she gets
He's the first one that goes into the food plot.
Always.
He's the last one to come out of the food plot.
In the evening, the buck fawn leads the family. And a good mother is going to be in a spot where she knows where he's going to go.
Right.
He's not going to be wandering all over. In the evening, she leads back to that bedding spot, and he's dragging along, following her. They're always dragging along. Like when kids go to the fair, they're racing out ahead to get there. And when you come back out to the parking lot, they're dragging behind. That's exactly what happens with these deer families. So
yeah. So I
it's
used
so
to.
important to know that buck fawn controls so much in the evening. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, we could talk about that. There's so many things to talk about, but that's real interesting to me too, because what I see on that, you had just mentioned the 8:30 or so is when we see the bucks moving around. Well, coming off of this here food source, the first one is the big buck before daylight. He's got his stomach full, and he's going to go in and lay down in the cover, right? And so what I see is they come back here just off the edge, lay down, and start chewing their cud because it's completely full, right? They just come in there and relax. These big doe comes in first. She starts walking around to lay down with her fawns. Well, about that time, he knows everything's safe. She's not stomping or making any noise. He's already got his cud moved into the second stomach. Then he gets up out of that and heads back to his daytime bed, right? And then that's the reason we see that movement. When I was out there in Iowa, and we had those big towers that we would stand and watch, I mean, I lived out of them almost. I rarely ever see a big buck in one of the plots at first light. He'd already moved off of it. So it's the complete opposite of what you see in the evening, right? So it's the big buck, it's the doe fawn, then it's the button buck in the morning, and complete opposite in the evening.
Complete opposite in the evening.
And that's the reason a guy should never hunt a food source in the morning. I mean, it's rare. He's coming in there maybe during the chase phase looking for where the does are and smelling and trying to find them along that edge, but wherever they're bedded at for daytime cover. But yeah, it's not very likely we're going to kill a good buck in a food plot in the morning. And so many people have ruined their hunting situation by doing that, you know. Well, you get in there 45 minutes before dark and you blew him out of there, or he heard you coming in because he's bedded right off the side of it, you know. But anyways, yeah. So what I usually see on doe bedding is about 75 yards back off the edge, right? And so on this, what we see is a thick, this is illustrating hinge cut trees all the way around the edge. And then
How
I
big
do
is that plot?
13 acres. And then I do the travel corridor around behind that. And then all my stand sites, mainly, they're pointed at the travel corridor as...
So that's the yellow.
Yes, exactly, the yellow. And so I have my back to the open field. And so the tree is protecting me from being seen. And since if the deer are out in the open, I can look over my shoulder and see what I want and have a shooting lane, you know, at a 45 out that way. But yeah, I'm focusing on the woods where the mature animal's probably going to be at. And then every stand site, I'm doing hubs in those. And what that is, it ends up being an edge in a thick area, an edge in a thick area. You know, so you can get multiple doe groups coming up through there, and the biggest buck that's traveling 4 or 5 properties during the chase phase of the rut, he's going through these hubs from one hub to the next because that's where he already knows he can pick up the most information at, period. And so I'm using terrain features and natural trails to begin with, and a lot of times I can only maybe find 3 to come into a spot naturally, but then I add 2 more if I possibly can, right? Again, just to encourage more of those doe families to come together, which they do not want to do because of the fact that they're year-round territorial. And so we're kind of forcing it because I let it get thick between there, you know, to where we're making
parallel pathways that the doe are coming into that area.
Exactly.
And then have perpendicular pathways that the buck have to do. Because otherwise, if you just have a narrow funnel where one family comes out at a time, the dominant family comes first, and then the other ones lag back, and they come and they stream through, and a buck can stand in one spot and watch everything. Naturally,
what I'll normally see on a good food source is parallel trails coming in about 20 yards apart.
Yes.
Because the different doe families want to use different trails so they don't have to run into that dominant one and get kicked in the face.
Yes,
you know?
exactly.
And so
if they only have one way in, they have to lag back and wait for her to clear.
100%. And while you're doing that system of trail edge, you're producing food. I mean, it's multiple things you're doing there, right? Yeah. And it's food during hunting season because that's when they're using the browse the most. And we've already had the frost by that time, and so most of the time.
Woody browse and forbs.
Yeah. So I believe there's more diversity of browse on this property than 99% of the other ones. So in this pollinator mix, I put 42 different plants, right? Besides the native ones that were already established there. And then just by getting the sunlight into everything else.
Can you explain what you mean by that, pollinator?
Pollinator. So, you know, got a hold of the biologist, talking to him about wanting to have quail habitat on the property. And I think we kind of, I guess I'll add one more piece to it. So this is food plot, and it's a long, narrow food plot. And actually, it's an old gas line that hadn't been cleaned out in probably 20 years. And I put that into Roundup Ready alfalfa, and that leads into a food plot here that I just put in 2 years ago. That's a lot of diverse vegetation with a water source. Then that leads into what was a 13-acre crop field here. And what I turned that into, like I mentioned, was a pollinator, and with 41 different plants. And then up underneath that pollinator vegetation around these stands, I've got probably 1.5 acres of clover up underneath that security cover and growing fine together.
So how did you choose the 41 seeds?
Just talking to the different biologists.
And you made the mix?
No, they came up with it for me.
Oh, okay.
And so I had some options, right, on what I wanted, or obviously what I wanted in it. But so I told them.
Is it all deer food, or is it a combination of cover and food?
It's a combination,
yeah.
Right? And so a lot of people in a big open field, for years, everybody done switchgrass.
Yeah.
And I get there, and it was a solid monoculture of 13 acres of switchgrass.
Inedible material.
No food.
Yeah.
Very, very little food. And then where you would see them that they would actually bed in it, most of the time, a thistle plant or something that was different in that field.
It's not a place a doe family wants to
no,
take
they don't
for
want anything.
children.
They don't really want it, right? Because there's no daytime food. So when we get out there, you're going to see most of this cover is 6 foot tall.
Yeah. Perfect.
Stands up over the winter.
And it's food.
Yeah, I got goldenrod 5 foot tall.
Yeah.
Top half-inch of goldenrod, 26% protein.
Yeah.
You know, stands up all year.
Yeah.
Right. Didn't cost me very much. Not near as much as warm season grass.
Yeah.
You know. Anyways.
Yeah, this grass obsession has always amazed me. You want to make a deer desert.
I have seldom see it work unless the deer numbers were so high that they had no option.
They're forced in there. Yeah.
To hide someplace, right? And then to set over top
Well, it's
of
the same thing with corn. The last place in the world a deer who loves variety in its life wants to be is in a monoculture of corn. If they're there, you forced them in there.
I done corny tasseling when I was a kid, and that's actually how I paid my way through college, contracting corny tasseling. So I'd have 3 to 5 tractors running at a time, and I would go from one tractor to the other tractor all day long walking through the corn. You know what I'm saying? So when I was a kid, we had all these weeds growing in the corn.
Exactly.
We had giant horseweed, or ragweed, I mean.
Yeah.
We called it horseweed. We had all these different weeds in there. And we get into a spot that might be a 30-yard circle of just big, tall weeds, and the deer would be there, right?
Yes, exactly.
And then over the years, so I went in the Marine Corps, come back, went to college, got the job as a contractor. They took all the weeds out of them. I mean, bare, right?
Yeah.
And so then where I would see the deer when I was running around in the fields is in the waterways, where the vegetation
That's one
was.
downside to Roundup or glyphosate invention is it's been wonderful for crop production, and it doesn't hurt people at all, but it does change the habitat in a negative way for deer because they don't have the variety. Deer seek variety all the time and everything.
I've used a tremendous amount of habitat in the woods. Roundup doing deer habitat in the woods over the years, and one really neat thing I've seen with Roundup is when those woody browse starts to come back after you've hit it hard with Roundup, the deer hammer it for some reason. I have no idea why, but I'm saying that fresh vegetation again. I don't know if it's pumping micronutrients at that time or what it is, but I've had guys say the same thing with cattle along a fence line when it would come back from being sprayed with Roundup.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
There's something in it. Of course, it's a salt base.
Yeah.
You know, it's a salt-based chemical, but
it is a salt. Yeah. Yeah, but I don't think you put enough of it on.
I don't think either.
Yeah. Any more than like when I know you use Redmond mineral and spread it out, and it's got salt in it, but it's going to be so diffuse then that it's not going to be like a salt lick.
Right.
It's just adding nutrients to the soil.
Right.
Not the salt, the other minerals.
Other 7%, yeah. But soil needs salt to be healthy. Soil uses salt as a conductor. And so for the life, the living organisms in soil, salt is needed. Now, as a kid, we'd put salt on a sidewalk and kill the weeds out of the cracks, you know. But again, all it's doing is drying those plants out. So I was at a show and I was talking to a guy that was at the Whitetail Institute booth that was selling seed, and I said, hey, deer aren't touching my brassicas. I said, we've planted them for 3 years and they just don't mess with them. He said, you take 5 pounds of salt and get you some hot water. You pour that salt in that hot water, stir it up real good, put it in your sprayer, spray that brassica plot. He said, they're gonna hammer it. It's like putting sugar on ice cream. And I hadn't tried it, but that's when I decided to start using the Redmond mineral and just broadcasting that the same type of thing over the top, right?
After emergence? Or because I've used it ever since you taught me about it, but I use it on the soil.
No, after emergence, but you just can't have dew on the vegetation, right?
Okay.
I got a guy here in Indiana that has an alfalfa plot, and he's got Redmond off of me 8 years in a row, And there's several years he's putting down 200 pounds an acre, and it's his best plot. And he said, when you spread it across your plot for about 2 to 3 weeks, they absolutely hammer it, right? I kept telling him, hey, slow down. You're going to get to the breaking point. You're putting too much on, I think.
Yeah.
He ain't seen it, right? So, no, I mean, all animals need salt. All of them, right?
Yes.
I talked to a biologist about rabbits one time. He said, you know, if you want very many rabbits, you got to go around putting little salt piles around. They got a small home range, and they're not going to reproduce very well if they don't have
let the
salt.
DNR know you're doing that in Michigan.
Well, I know, right?